The hour of justice for the American worker has arrived. Border security is a serious national issue and problem. A lack of security poses a substantial threat to the sovereignty and safety of the United States of America and its citizens. Most illegal immigration is coming from our southern border. I've said many times that the American people will not pay for the wall. And I've made that clear to the government of Mexico. NAFTA has been a terrible deal, a total disaster for the United States from its inception, costing us as much as $60 billion a year with Mexico alone in trade deficits. You say, who negotiates these deals?
I lament and am against the decision by the United States to extend the wall, which for years has divided us instead of uniting us. Mexico does not believe in walls. I've said time again, Mexico will not pay for any wall.
I'm CNN national correspondent Ed Lavandera, and we're coming to you live this morning from Nogales, Arizona. Just on the other side of the fence you see behind me is Nogales, Mexico, and we are continuing our border series, taking that journey from Brownsville, Texas, all the way to San Diego, California, near the 2,000 miles. And as we show you the drone shot that we'll be playing around with in this Facebook Live, you can see our Border Patrol agent standing guard here just off to our side. They've been patrolling here throughout the morning. So we want to get started to some of the questions that you have. Being asked, what's the reaction been from locals to Trump's executive order on the wall? You know, it's been a rather intense reaction, as you might imagine, especially along here in border communities where so many people know undocumented immigrants that live are part of their families. So that's something that's very normal, very typical that you hear from a lot of the residents that live in this area. So they're very concerned about that. In speaking with the head of the Border Patrol Union, they welcome a lot of these things. One of the things Border Patrol agents have complained a lot about is this idea of catch and release, that a lot of times that migrants that are caught sneaking into the United States are caught, they're given a court date and then released. Detention centers have been packed, and that has been a source of a great deal of concern. They say that essentially these migrants never show up for their court hearings. So a great deal of emotion surrounding these issues, very anxious to see how all of these executive orders are going to play out in reality, which could take some weeks and months to kind of see happen. One of the other questions we're getting is how effective do people here in the border communities think that the wall has been? This is a fascinating question, really, because there's already about between 600 and 700 miles of border fencing and barricades that already exist along the U.S. southern border. It is not a continuous line, as we've shown in our reporting. In a lot of these places, the border fence comes to an abrupt end. Here in Nogales, this is an area that is fortified with this fence for several miles, and then it gets out into the more remote areas, and that's usually where it kind of comes to an abrupt end. Humanitarians and migrant rights groups have always been very concerned about this. They say that these fences have essentially driven migrants out into the more remote desert areas where it's much more dangerous and where it's much more deadly for a lot of this. Someone else is asking, are locals happy with the amount the wall will cost? You know, this is another great source. And one of the questions that we've heard repeatedly from people is like, and people will tell you that they feel that the wall plays better in states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Iowa, people in communities where they don't have a lot of experience living on the border. A lot of people here will tell you that we've seen how these border walls and these fences have worked up close for more than 10 years now. And so they're very concerned about this. So they really ask, you know, at what point is too much for some of these walls? There's estimates out that the border wall that Donald Trump is considering could cost anywhere between $10 to $25 billion. So they're wondering, is that worth it? Is that price worth going through the extent and the trouble? And it's going to take some time. This is a very difficult issue to navigate through. Remember, in a lot of places along the border, the land that butts up against the border is private land. So the last time this was done back in 2006 during the Secure Fence Act that George W. Bush signed into law, there was a series of lawsuits, eminent domain lawsuits, trying to get the right of way. And that essentially created these gaps in a lot of these fences where private landowners had to be given access to their land that was south of the fence but north of the border. So those are just some of the issues that make all of this very difficult to navigate. Someone is asking, do locals have rights to the area Trump plans to build? Well, I think that's one of the things I was talking about, is really this private land issue is really something. And here in particular, in Nogales, the fence is built very close to the border, but in places like Texas as well, you see that these border fences and these walls haven't really been constructed right on the border. Remember, in Texas, the Rio Grande and the way that meanders through the state is what creates the border between Mexico and Texas. However, that fence doesn't necessarily straddle very close to the river in many cases, so it creates that no man's land where people are kind of stuck in that area between the fence and the river. Wanted to show you real quick as we're talking here. You see our drone flying over and get you a sense of the technology that is in play here along the border. That is one of the camera stands here in Nogales, very high-tech cameras, and those are monitored from another location where Border Patrol agents in a room can monitor, zoom in on areas, and then pass along that information to Border Patrol agents that are working on the ground. So that is a view south. You're looking from that stand and those high-tech cameras, infrared. They work at night, obviously, and this is an area that is monitored 24 hours a day, and that's looking back over across the border. You can see us on the ground here, I think, as well, looking back into Nogales, Mexico. Does anyone know what the new wall will look like? Well, there has been a series of discussions, and it would look very different from what we understand from what this type of fencing would look like. From what we understand and what experts have been involved in some of these talks, is that it would be essentially miles and miles of these concrete barriers supported in the middle by steel barricades. So it would essentially be a wall that you could no longer see through. And this would be dug deep into the ground as well, could reach as high as 20 feet. And those calculations really kind of get to the sense that this could cost billions of dollars and be much more difficult. If you've been watching our reporting throughout the week, if you look out into areas like the Big Bend National Park of Texas, many people wondering exactly how you would create that kind of infrastructure on the ground in a place so remote and so difficult to build in. Remember, it's not just building the wall. You would then need to have access and roads dug in next to that wall to give access to Border Patrol agents and federal government officials to be able to maintain and repair the wall. It's one of the things that I think a lot of people might not understand, is that once these walls get through, there's a lot of places where you see where wires and things have been cut through. All of that needs to be come back and maintained and repaired, and that is another great cost and requires a great deal of manpower as well to work as well. Is there a big influx of people across the border in the area you're in? It's really interesting because a lot of these border towns along the southern border on the U.S. side, generally relatively small towns, if you will. There's areas of great population like Brownsville and McAllen, El Paso. And then you get into smaller areas like Nogales, Arizona is a small town, but it's the communities on the south side of the border that I think a lot of you might be surprised to learn that it could be a city of more than 1 million people. So these are highly populated areas on the Mexican side, which is always kind of fascinating to see. You take El Paso, Texas, for example, a town of I think about 650,000 people. Juarez, Mexico, on the other side is a city of almost 1.5 million people. So you take that area, that whole area all together, and that you're looking at an area of more than 2 million people. So, and Tijuana, Mexico is kind of the same way. The Nogales here on the other side is another large city. I think that might kind of come as a surprise to a lot of people if you're not familiar or traveled a lot through this area. Another question about what about the illegal tunnels under the wall? That's kind of fascinating. We're going to take a closer look in that in our the last part of our series, which airs on Aaron Burnett Out Front Friday night, 7 o'clock Eastern, if you care to watch. And we're going to take you inside one of these tunnels in the San Diego area, where officials there tell us that in the last 10 years in that area alone, some 30 tunnels have been discovered. And Border Patrol agents will tell you that this is really kind of a response to the fortification and the technology that has been put on the ground and the boots on the ground in a lot of these areas that has essentially forced them underground. In fact, they have a special team of Border Patrol agents that are called the Tunnel Rats. So we'll join one of those guys and show you that Friday night on CNN and watch those people work and how they operate. And it's really kind of another fascinating aspect, all of this. As the technology and the fortification has increased on the ground, you see some of these smugglers going underground, and a lot of people think as that continues to happen above ground that you'll see more and more of those tunnels. So is there a lot of reverse migration of Americans going to Mexico? I don't have full numbers on just how many Americans go to Mexico to live, but there is quite a few pockets of American expats, if you will, who live in Mexico. That's also, kind of a very popular thing. And that question of migration is also really interesting to talk about as well. According to the Hispanic Pew Research Center, the net migration of Mexican migrants coming from Mexico into the United States since the economic downturn in 2008 has started to reverse. That more Mexican migrants are returning home because of the economic conditions here in the United States. However, that doesn't tell the full story, because at the same time, we've also seen an increase in the number of Central American migrants coming from places like Honduras and El Salvador, where gang violence has been on the uptick, very dangerous. So, if you go to these border communities on the Mexican side, there are a lot of shelters in place that cater and try to help a lot of these migrants who have made their way through Mexico, providing clothing and food. And you go to those places, it gives you a chance to talk to a lot of these migrants and hear the stories of how they've made it here to the border's edge. And a lot of the people that you meet there in Mexico are actually from El Salvador and Honduras. So that is kind of another eye-opening part of traveling the border region, just getting a sense of exactly how these migrants are moving. And one other thing, I remember focusing on this issue quite a bit about 7 or 8 years ago, and anecdotally you would hear from people that they use what's called coyotes, which is coyote, which is another word for smugglers. They were charging about $1,500 7, 8 years ago. I've been told by several migrants that journey now costs as much as $5,000. So we will continue our journey along the southern border, ending the week here in California. We'll move on from Arizona. Thanks for watching this latest edition from Nogales, Arizona.